An interesting question came up in the comments. A viewer asked, "What's your take on the paradox of good versus evil, particularly in regards to the light that comes from the darkness?" I asked him to clarify, because I wanted to find out if he had something more concrete in mind, or if there was a specific example he was thinking about. He brought up the question, essentially, of whether the Gnostic demiurge could be seen as playing a role in the unfolding cosmic drama, and also brought up the idea that persecuted heretics can sometimes become the new inquisitors. And I think that the Gnostic myth presents us with an interesting way to think about this basic question, which many philosophers, theologians, and everyday people have wrestled with over the ages. In Orthodox religion, the question is why a good God created the devil. If you believe in the heretical teaching that this world was created by an ignorant or malevolent deity, then the existence of suffering or evil in the world is no mystery. But the question remains whether the demiurge should be seen as evil and as an enemy to be defeated, or whether he is fulfilling a necessary function. In sociology, there's the functionalist view, and there's the conflict theory view. And these two schools of thought relate to this question. And I'm going to bring this question into the socio-political sphere in order to make it less abstract, and to draw some parallels between the world of myth and the world of our day-to-day concerns and struggles. I believe that how we think about religious questions is intimately bound up in how we think about political and socioeconomic issues. It may be helpful to think about people as falling into one of three stages. In the first stage, everything is fine. Your parents and teachers have all the answers. Sunday school stories are true. God is good. Police are good. The president is good. The laws of the state are just. The economy is fair. You're in a state of trust. A person in the second stage would say you're naive. They will say that you're a brainwashed sheep. They'll say you haven't taken the red pill. You're still living inside the matrix. A person in the second stage has awakened from the first stage due to some inconsistency or contradiction. They see that something is wrong. Maybe their parents and teachers are wrong. Maybe they've been lied to. Maybe the system is rigged. Maybe God is evil. And it's interesting that Solomon says that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. And Eve takes a bite of the fruit of knowledge because she doubts God. If she trusted God, she wouldn't have eaten the fruit. But maybe there's something God is hiding. Maybe there's something God doesn't want her to know. Maybe he doesn't have her best interest at heart. Maybe he just wants to keep her in ignorance. She doesn't trust God. She begins to fear God. And this is the beginning of knowledge. She is the young woman who enters college, and hears some feminist college professor rail against the patriarchy and rant about how women are oppressed by a male-dominated society. Students hear from Marxist professors about the evils of capitalism, and how the top 1% of greedy capitalists control more wealth than the bottom 90% combined. The power elite use religion to control the masses. Atheistic professors ridicule belief in creationism or in the existence of the human soul. Everything the student may have previously believed is turned on its head. And this isn't always how it happens. It isn't necessarily caused by entering into college, but I think this is a common experience for many people. And I think that for many people, it's around this age that they start to really question things and challenge many conventional views about religion, government, and various institutions and structures in society. Paradise is lost. Sin has entered the world. They've woken up from the matrix, or they've taken the red pill, if you like. Not everyone does, of course. Some remain in a state of arrested development, you might say. They cling to the familiar. This new paradigm is too uncomfortable, too disorienting, too confusing, or too frightening. And many of the Gnostic myths mirror this kind of complete reversal. The serpent in the Garden of Eden becomes a kind of Prometheus figure who offers Eve gnosis. The God of the Old Testament stories becomes the demiurge. He isn't all-knowing and loving. He's an ignorant, arrogant tyrant. The world is ruled by this demiurge and his archons. The material world is a prison in which spirits are enslaved. And a lot of people who are drawn to this version of the Gnostic myth are also drawn to left-wing political ideologies. Both offer an antithesis, which is part of the process of dialectical development. But eventually, the internal contradiction in the antithesis emerges as well, and they find themselves moving toward a higher synthesis. And questions, such as the one that was posed at the beginning of this discussion, will start to occur to someone who is approaching or moving into the third stage. Moving from the second stage into the third is just as uncomfortable, disorienting, and scary as moving from the first stage into the second is. And some people get stuck at this stage, just like some people get stuck at the first. People who are in the second stage, who aren't ready to progress to the third, will often attack you. They may see you as a kind of traitor. For them, it's either the blue pill or the red pill. They think in terms of black and white, just like stage 1 people do. Except they've juxtaposed the pairs of opposites. You're either plugged into the matrix or you're unplugged. They may see you like Cypher. And there are people who do revert back to the first stage. But it's a very different thing to go backwards to stage 1 than to move forwards to stage 3. But the person at stage 2 often can't tell the difference. For them, they're caught in a cosmic struggle between light and darkness. If you're not with them, you must be with the enemy. And a person at stage 1 will also see a stage 3 person as an enemy. And they may even see you as more of an enemy because you're more insidious and harder to detect. The Valentinian Gnostics blended into the mainstream churches. They seemed on the surface to profess the same creed. But under the surface, they meant something more subtle and esoteric. The Sethians, on the other hand, were much more of a stage 2 sect. Among the Valentinians, there were ideas about the demiurge as having a role to play. He was necessary to a certain stage of human evolution. It was more like the functionalist school in sociology, and less like the conflict theorist school. It's very interesting to read about how they interpreted Paul's letters. Paul was seen as sort of the grand master of the Gnostics. And I plan to talk about the book of Romans, and maybe some of Paul's other letters from a Gnostic perspective in the future, if there are viewers who would be interested in that. But I don't want to drift too far off topic for now. It may seem like I've gone off on a tangent that has nothing to do with the opening question already, but I don't think that I have. I just wanted to lay some groundwork. I'll get more deeply into the heart of the question in just a minute. But I'm not a stage 1 person or a stage 2 person. But I've passed through both stages and retained what's valuable in each. And I've integrated many of the contradictions and polarities and achieved more of a stage 3 understanding of myself and the world. And some of my stage 3 views confuse people who are in either the first or the second stage. Occasionally, I say some things that a conservative or an orthodox religious person would agree with. Then they lose their mind when they hear some of the other stuff I have to say. I definitely say some things that will appeal to people who hold left-wing views, or who are atheist, or who follow the left-hand path. Then they get triggered when they come across something else I've said that goes against their ideology, and that they find problematic. Just to give a general impression of my background, I was raised in a very socially conservative, religious fundamentalist home, deep in the heart of Texas. In high school, I got very interested in Christian apologetics, I felt called to the ministry and was involved in a missionary organization for a time. I've preached in churches. I know the Bible very well. I've read it straight through several times. I took my religion quite seriously, and I also began to study other religions, with the aim of proving that they were all wrong and that my religion was the one true religion, and converting people from other religions to my own. But critically examining other religions led me to develop the analytical tools which I eventually, inevitably, applied to my own religion. I was deeply motivated by a genuine desire for truth. I became very interested in philosophy and esoteric subjects. I experimented with various forms of meditation and physical and mental discipline over a period of many years. I experimented with drugs too. But for me, it was more about exploring different states of consciousness than it was about partying. For quite a while, I considered myself an atheist and a socialist. I was involved in the Occupy movement. I don't mean that I posted about it on Facebook. I mean I actually participated in it, and in more than one city. I've been all over the place. I've done a lot of things. I've slept on the street. I've received charity. I've given charity. I've been paid hundreds of dollars per hour to go to fancy parties and black tie events and hang out with rich people. My tale is a tale of two cities. I've done volunteer work around the world. I've worked with psych patients, and I've also been a psych patient. I've accomplished things that few people have accomplished, and that I take pride in. And I've done things that I wish I could change and that I'm ashamed of. I've experienced mind-blowing, intense pleasure and ecstasy. And I've experienced absolute horror and excruciating pain. I've had brushes with death, and I've been on the verge of suicide. I've descended into the valley of insanity and ascended to the mountaintop of illumination. I don't like to reveal too many personal details about myself in my videos, but that's a little bit of insight into who I am and where I'm coming from. Life is the journey to self-knowledge, and the task of accepting and making sense of your journey and integrating your experiences and lessons into a meaningful narrative. And for me, that's what the heart of the question is about. The demiurge doesn't matter. He provides you with the structure you need in the first stage, and offers you an external authority to rebel against in the second. The devil doesn't matter. He's there to test you and tempt you as a necessary part of your evolution. God doesn't matter. The cosmic battle between light and darkness doesn't matter. The patriarchy doesn't matter. Social injustice and economic inequality don't matter. You have to understand what I mean, though. There's a reason why everything is the way it is. Even when there is no reason, there's a reason why there is no reason. It's necessary to experience life as meaningless so that you can experience the search for meaning and the joy of discovering it. And yes, I do say that ultimately, darkness must exist in order for light to exist. I believe that existence is fundamentally paradoxical. There's no ultimate escape from dualism. Polarity is necessary in order for there to be conscious experience. There must be both figure and ground. Something can only be perceived in contrast to something else. And as Berkeley said, to be is to be perceived. So being requires opposition. For anything to exist, it must be perceived, which is to say that it must stand out in contrast to something. So yin and yang are eternal principles, and mind is eternal. This isn't to say that consciousness is eternal. The mind passes through alternating cycles of consciousness and unconsciousness. Genesis says that God created the world and then took a nap. But this is completely backwards. God went to sleep and then dreamed the universe into existence. He dreamed that he was a man. But he couldn't dream of a man without dreaming of a woman. So he dreamed he was a woman too. But as the woman in the dream, God dreamed of the man as separate from himself. And as the man, he experienced the woman as other. And the dream became real to him. In the dream, he had a beginning. And in order for him to dream of having a beginning, he had to dream of having an end. And so death entered into the dream. It had to. The dream of life would be impossible without death. And the dream would be pretty dull if nothing happened. If you're eternal, you've got to find some way to entertain yourself for all of eternity. You can either have endless boredom or endless variety and excitement. But of course, that's another paradox, really. Because you can't have excitement without boredom, or boredom without excitement. You can't perceive the flow of a river without the stillness of the shore. And what is stillness without movement? But movement requires motivation, and action requires a cause. No one moves from one spot to another spot without a reason. Either they don't like the spot they're in, or another spot appeals to them for some reason. You like some things, you dislike other things. Some things make you feel good, other things make you feel bad. Every movement is a movement toward what you desire, and away from what you don't desire. Fear and desire, or pleasure and pain, are responsible for all behavior. We call one thing good and another thing bad. But when God created the Garden of Eden, he said that it was good. But of course, it can only be good in contrast to something else that isn't good. But in the form of Adam and Eve, in his dream, he hadn't experienced anything that wasn't good. To have knowledge of the good, he had to have the knowledge of both good and evil. Luckily, out of the divine unconscious came the serpent. And it's interesting that the tree of knowledge was in the center of the garden. All of the pairs of opposites that branch outward from the seed of creation emanate from this central point, which is the universal mind in which all knowledge is contained. And all knowledge comes through experience. To have infinite knowledge is to have infinite experience. To bite into the fruit of knowledge is to enter deeply into the experience of living. To become God is to know both good and evil, both pleasure and suffering, both victory and defeat, both sin and redemption, both forgiveness and revenge, both power and helplessness. And of course, this would take many lifetimes. And there were Gnostics who really ran with this idea. The idea of taking the road to excess, to the palace of wisdom, is a very stage 2 way of thinking. And it's normal to pass through this stage in your late teens and early to mid-20s. It doesn't reflect a mature spiritual wisdom, though. An extreme interpretation of this doctrine of sinning for the sake of salvation could lead someone to justify rape and all manner of horrific acts. But in order for the experience of rape to exist, the experience of being raped must also exist. There can't be a rapist without a rape victim. To put it in theological terms, in order for God to experience one, he must experience the other. So to avoid experiencing the one, he wills to abstain from experiencing the other. When God commands, "Thou shalt not kill," he means that he will not kill because he doesn't want to be killed. As Jesus said, the whole law can be summed up in 2 commands. Love God with all your heart, and love your neighbor as yourself. It's interesting that he says that the second is like the first. Really think about that. Loving your neighbor is like loving God. They're the same thing. Your neighbor is God, and so are you. To put it differently, your neighbor is you. Otherwise, it would be ridiculous to ask you to love your neighbor as yourself. It makes sense to love your neighbor as yourself because your neighbor is yourself. You are God, dreaming that he is both you and your neighbor. And this realization of gnosis is the spirit of the law. This is the law of the Gnostic. But of course, there's also the letter of the law. This is the law of the demiurge. And the demiurge is sometimes called the lawgiver and is associated with the God of Moses, with the God of the Old Testament. Without gnosis, a person is a slave to the law of the demiurge. It's only with gnosis that a person is free from the law. As Paul says, he is not under the law, but under grace. But in response to the immature stage 2 Gnostics, who preached sin for salvation, he asked, should we sin that grace may abound? Heaven forbid. Orthodox Christians think that Paul was condemning Gnosticism. Nothing could be further from the truth. He was defending true Gnosticism against a gnosis falsely so called. Some who had passed into the second stage, but who hadn't yet reached the third and who lacked proper guidance, were engaging in some abhorrent practices and spreading some deeply misguided teachings. In the end, the stage 1 church suppressed these teachings as heretical, and in a sense that's good. But it's also bad, because they suppressed stage 3 teachings as well, and cut themselves off from the inner teachings of their own religion, which was originally a mystery religion. To paraphrase Paul, they became nothing more than the outer form of a religion without a soul. They're worshippers of the demiurge. They're slaves to the letter of the law, without the gnosis of the Spirit that makes men free. But the stage 2 and stage 3 church went underground and survived and sprang up again in different places at different times. Of course, the Inquisition tried to stamp them out wherever they emerged. What the Inquisition didn't seem to understand is that gnosis can't be wiped out. Even if you burned every copy of every scroll, and burned every so-called heretic at the stake, and locked everyone in a dungeon who had been corrupted by these teachings, the light would reveal itself to some poor, uneducated peasant. The entire religion would come to him spontaneously out of nowhere. The details of his vision would be different from the visions of men who came centuries before, but the archetypal themes and images would all be there. I believe this has happened many times. When you try to trace the history of the esoteric tradition, there's a temptation to try to trace one individual or group back to an earlier one. And there have been underground schools and secret societies that have preserved ancient teachings, of course, and passed them on in a line of apostolic succession. And they've played an important part. But just because a secret society traces its lineage back to some other group in the ancient past, that doesn't necessarily mean anything. They may still carry the torch that was passed down to them through the ages, but that doesn't mean it's still lit. Their lineage may have preserved the stage 2 teachings, but lost the stage 3 teachings. I think one thing to look out for is an over-reliance on some leader, teacher, author, or set of writings. Another warning sign is that they've become obsessed with attacking members of their own group who aren't ideologically pure enough, or persecuting people who they see as heretics. Slaves of the demiurge worship the dead letter, while true Gnostics live by the Spirit, and anyone who says differently is a dangerous heretic and should be excommunicated. I'm being ironic, of course, but that seems to be how the demiurge principle works. There are as many paths to darkness as there are to the light. And every path toward light leads to darkness if you get turned around. And I've commented before on the path of darkness as a path to the light. Of course, the danger is in getting lost in the darkness. Without a teacher who has passed through the second stage into the third, the second stage is very dangerous. And I don't think stage 1 religion is necessarily wrong to fear and steer its sheep away from the occult. Most of occult teachings that are promulgated only lead to the second stage, without offering any path of initiation into the third. For some individuals who successfully internalize the important lessons taught during the first stage, it may be possible to successfully navigate the trials of stage 2 without a guide, because they're guided by the inner light. I'm actually very grateful for my more conservative religious training which I received as a child. It may shock some people to hear me say that. But this ties into the idea of the paradox between light and darkness. It's interesting to me that many atheists arrive at atheism as a result of reading the Bible. The contradictions in the Bible are what awaken their critical thinking. Without these contradictions, they might remain in an unquestioning state of blind faith. So the demiurge lies. He does seek to keep man in ignorance, but he does so in a way that helps them to awaken. He gives laws which sometimes violate other laws. He demands absolute obedience, yet makes absolute obedience absolutely impossible. Paul talks a lot about how, with the law, sin came into the world. And this was the point all along. Exoteric religion demands that you accept logically contradictory beliefs. The secret purpose of these absurd religious dogmas is to force you to think for yourself. It's impossible to consistently believe all of these contradictory dogmas. And in attempting to defend the teachings of the Orthodox Church, a person is unavoidably led toward heretical positions. Is this by accident or by design? Can you now see the hidden meaning behind sayings such as, "Love your enemies and bless those who curse you"? I'll end with that thought. But I'll return to some of these themes in the future. So if you've enjoyed this discussion, be sure to subscribe, hit the thumbs up button, and share this video with others. Check out my website, and please consider making a donation if you like my work. Thank you for listening. Peace.